Today on Market Journal, hear about some of the most troublesome winter annual weeds that are popping up this time of year. We'll give you some ways to control them. Does this unusual growing and harvest season mean you should change your planting decisions for next year? Our analyst weighs in on that and more. And earlier this year, a lucky few were approved by the Nebraska Department of Agriculture to grow hemp. We'll take you to one of those farms and see how it's going. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you could be here for our last show of October. We've got a good one in store for you. And starting off the broadcast, according to UNL Weed Management Specialist Dr. Amit Jhala, it's the time of year when producers in eastern Nebraska need to be on the lookout for winter annual weeds like pennycress, downy brome, and even tansy mustard. But he cautions mare's tail is particularly noteworthy.
We conducted some research before a few years and we came to know like about 75 to 80% of mare's tail in eastern Nebraska, they germinate in the fall, and therefore fall is the best time to manage them because mare's tail is a weed which can emerge 10 out of 12 months. So it can also emerge in early spring as well as in summertime.
And I guess even to make things even more complicated, it's becoming a lot more resistant to the herbicides that you can use for it, yes?
Yes, particularly mare's tail, which is now resistant to glyphosate as well as a number of ALS chemistries. So now glyphosate and those ALS inhibiting herbicides are no more long effective to control mare's tail.
So what are some tips you have for trying to manage those best you can, the ones that are resistant or are becoming resistant?
2,4-D and dicamba has been typically used in the fall, and that can provide good control of mare's tail as well as some other broadleaf weeds. And if some grass weeds are present, generally you can tank mix glyphosate with 2,4-D or dicamba, and that might be a good start in the fall.
So what does the data suggest as to when these weeds will start to be in the fields and when you need to begin your weed control plan?
So even right now, if you go to the field in corn and soybean, harvesting is getting delayed due to a lot of rain that we have. So if you go to the field and you will find mare's tail is coming up. So this is the time generally you will see mare's tail starts emerging, and you can still wait for about 2 to 3 weeks, and once you harvest your corn and soybean, I would suggest to spray some herbicides, burn down herbicides that can provide effective control in the fall, because at this time mare's tail will be relatively small and then it can be easily controlled by herbicides if you compare with very early spring or late in summer.
From what you've seen firsthand and from what producers have told you, does this seem like it's going to be an especially bad year, maybe an easier year, typical year? What do you think?
In my opinion, it will be a bad year this year. Number of reasons. Number one, we had plenty of rain this year, so we have plenty of moisture in the soil, and that helps with new emergence of fall winter annual weeds, including mare's tail. And the another reason is we had about 400,000 acres were under prevented planting, so weed control was not the best, and there were a number of weeds were growing in those prevented planting acreage, and now you will see more and more winter annual weeds in those fields. So this year, yeah, I think it will be more careful. Growers will have to be for weed control.
And I guess, the longer you wait, the more herbicide you're going to have to use, which just ends up being more money that you end up spending.
Yes, especially for mare's tail, because it can overwinter in rosette stage, and early next year when weather is good, it can start growing and it can go tall very soon. So then when your meristem is too tall, then it will be hard to be effectively controlled by the same herbicide that you apply when weeds are relatively small.
Amit also doesn't recommend applying residual herbicides in the fall unless you have a lot of problems with mare's tail. It's relatively expensive and you'll get more value applying it in the early spring. Switching gears to cattle now, and you may have seen the story we brought to you last week about preparing cows and calves for weaning. But during weaning, it's also an important time to monitor your cow's body condition score. Ranged cow nutritionist Dr. Travis Mulliniks says if your cow's body condition score is less than 5, then it's a good idea to wean early.
And so the reason why body condition score now is important is that once we wean, that's the most important time to put body condition score back on that cow before the winter hits and calving next year. So it's really critical if you look at your cows and where they're at today in terms of when should I wean that calf. So if my cow's in a thinner body condition score, less than a body condition score of 5, we need to wean a little earlier and give that cow more time to put on body condition score before winter hits.
And 5 is the number you want to remember. Too low and the cow runs into issues when it gets cold outside and can have reproductive concerns. Too high and you may see problems in calving and also have to deal with extra nutrition requirements.
They're both bad on different sides of the scale. So we've got a cow that's a body condition score 8. It's going to be obese. She's actually going to have higher nutrient requirements because of her body weight and her size. And then she can have some calving issues as well. So as body condition score increases above that 6, 7, 8, you start getting calving issues with cows that have harder times calving, more cows that have to have assistance in calving. On that 3 side, we have similar issues of that cow's too thin. She has not enough body reserves for the winter. So we think about stress of our cold stress. That fat on her as body condition score is a supplement itself. And so when she's a 3, there's not a lot of supplement on her body to offset any lack of nutrients coming from our forage or our feed stuff.
You can find more on this topic on the Market Journal website. Time to get a look at the markets now, and on Tuesday I was joined by DTN lead analyst Todd Hultman. This week's Crop Progress Report showed the Nebraska corn crop is 30% harvested. That's not too far off from the pace of 33% this time last year. For Nebraska soybeans, harvest is at 60%. That's actually above last year's 52% pace, but behind the 67% 5-year average. I began this week's interview by asking Todd what we can learn from these numbers.
Well, I would say, Troy, for Nebraska, we're actually doing better than most across the Corn Belt. We haven't had the big winter storm yet like the Dakotas did. We haven't had the excessive moisture that a lot of areas did. So Nebraska's faring pretty well. It's the rest of the Corn Belt that I'm very concerned about for the reasons I just stated, and also because we've still got crops out there that are fairly immature in a lot of areas and just not ready for winter.
So with everything that's happened this year, any advice for producers who are starting to plan for next year? Do they need to take a different approach when making those 2020 planning decisions?
Boy, it's very difficult to outguess Mother Nature. Who would have thought we'd had the year that we've seen this year? I mean, we've never had a planting season like this in my lifetime, and for most of the listeners out there, I don't think anyone can think of a tougher planting situation than what we saw nationally this year for the corn and soybean crops. So it's very hard to outguess or outmaneuver Mother Nature on those instances. As far as anything else, I just always say you have to keep your ears and eyes open, and you can't just always depend on the way things have gone in the past, and that's maybe the best help I could offer.
Yeah, and when it comes to ag exports, China always comes to mind, so there's been talk of some purchases, but we've heard that before. What are the updates you have for us on our dealings with China?
Yes, well, as things stand right now, China has been a more active buyer in this new crop season, 2019 to 20. Their commitments right now for soybeans are up over 200 million bushels, and that's much better than what we were looking at a year ago. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is not having the same level of soybean purchasing interest that we saw a year ago. For one reason, our soybean prices are a little over $1 higher than they were a year ago right now. Also, I think there was just maybe a little sense of concern a year ago about how the whole tariff situation would play out, and maybe there was a little more concern about maintaining their supplies of soybeans. That doesn't seem to be coming through this year. But China has been active. We had another rumor in the market today that perhaps they'd buy another 360 million bushels of U.S. soybeans without charging their private companies tariffs. It didn't have a lot of price impact in our market today, and I think part of it is, as you say, we hear these rumors come and go, and we don't have any solid evidence yet.
And also read where you wrote that you said if things with China don't become clear by next spring, then farmers may just say, well, I don't know if China's going to buy these soybeans, so I won't plant them. But so what would that look like for U.S. ag?
Oh, Troy, that is my number one concern moving forward and looking at the spring of 2020. If we have anything close to a normal weather season again, unlike what we saw this year, we're going to have about 180 million acres available to plant corn and soybeans. Now, if there's no confidence in the U.S. soybean demand, and we only get 80 or 85 million acres of soybeans planted, well, that leaves 95 to 100 million acres of corn. That's a very bearish scenario for our corn market, and really makes it tough once again on the U.S. ag economy as a whole. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty between now and then. A lot can happen in the next 6 months before we start planting again. But just the way things look right now, that is definitely my number one concern.
Is there anything else that you're tracking internationally that we should keep an eye on?
Well, of course, we're always interested in exports. Our corn exports are having a very tough time right now. Brazil's outcompeting us. Argentina had a bigger corn crop this year. They've got an election where there's a possibility. I think they're afraid of perhaps an export tax hike coming. So it's possible that Argentina has been a more aggressive seller and competitor for our corn market. And so that's been a very tough demand concern for us right now. And then as an outlier, we've got Brexit always in the background. But overall, I can't say that Brexit is going to have a big impact on our ag markets.
Okay. And I wanted to take a second to talk about ethanol as well. Biofuel groups, they're unhappy with the EPA's rule on blending requirements and say it's falling short of what they were promised. So where does this stem from, and what do you see happening?
Boy, it seems like it's been a long time contention with EPA and our ethanol support groups. And this just seems to be another loop in the roller coaster once again. Earlier this month, it looked like good news for the biofuel industry that there would be some compensation for the refinery waivers that have been promised by EPA so that we could maintain that 15 billion gallon mandate for our corn ethanol demand. Yet when EPA came out with an actual proposal, they only suggested compensating for roughly half of those waivers. So that was another big disappointment to the industry. I'm sure they'll continue negotiating that back and forth. But it remains a concern for our corn demand as a whole. The 15 billion bushel mandate gives us about roughly 5.2, 5.3 billion bushels of corn demand each year, and we just hate to see that get diluted.
And finally, Todd, as we leave you today, people are working out budgets for next year, and they're going through their marketing and risk management plans. What final advice do you have for us?
It's always, it's typically tough this time of year when you're in the harvest period, but I would say that there could be some pricing opportunities in January, especially if we see some significant adjustments to the crop estimates for corn and beans that I suspect may be coming. The other thing, I don't think it's too early right now to consider at least making some new crop sales for 2020 corn, especially keeping in mind the concern I have about the number of planting acres that could be in play next spring.
Thanks again to Todd for being our guest this week. And next week, our analyst will be Lee Schultz from Iowa State University. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Next up, there aren't many places in the U.S. where proso millet is grown as a cash crop, but Nebraska is one of the top 3 states for proso millet production, along with neighboring Colorado and South Dakota. It's something Leon Kriesel has grown on his farm near Gurley in the southern panhandle for about 50 years. He's also the only person selling Proso millet seed in Nebraska and has grown almost every Proso millet variety released by the University of Nebraska. Read about the industry's efforts to expand Proso millet markets and improve Proso millet genetics in the October Nebraska Farmer. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And Al, we've reached the last several days of October. What do you see in the forecast?
Well, Troy, you're exactly right. We're here at the end of the month, and we're looking at the month of November, and it looks like we're going to see a little bit of old man weather show his head, at least briefly, as we go through this next 7-day period. The biggest question is, in accordance to the models, is who's going to be right, the GFS model or the Euro model, and it makes a big difference as we get into Monday and Tuesday in relation to the potential for snowfall, particularly across southern and southeastern Nebraska. So as we go to the upper air models, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that we do have this big upper air trough that is pivoting through the region, and that's going to bring some very stormy activity. And as this system drags toward the south, low pressure over the western portions of Kansas will allow basically an upslope flow regime to materialize, and we will start to see this pivot through the panhandle over the next 24 hours. And by the time we get into Sunday, we are going to see the vast majority of the energy shifting to our east. But as that high pressure settles toward the south, it is going to force that upslope flow, and we are looking at the potential for accumulating snowfall, at least from the GFS standpoint, from north central Nebraska down through the panhandle. Now, here's where the differences start to occur. On Monday, the GFS wants to keep this as a single unit and drives a big trough toward the east. We get low pressure situation in southeastern portions of Colorado, and that will gradually start to fill moisture up toward the north. And right now, it looks like the best snowfall accumulation on Monday will be to our north. And on Tuesday, the GFS keeps this as a one big broad trough, whereas the Euro keeps the low pressure back toward the west. So in this situation, most of the energy from the GFS is going to move to the south of the state of Nebraska, and we will see some flurry activity. But in the way of a strong accumulating snowfall, it just doesn't appear to be in the cards with the GFS. And then that will move this big trough into the eastern corn belt as we get into the midweek period, as high pressure starts to shift toward our southeast. That's going to allow some return flow into the western part of the state and start to bring our temperatures back up, approaching the near normal. Most likely will be on Thursday, though, as this next trough starts to weaken, and this one moves toward the Great Lakes. Low pressure develops in southwestern Kansas, but once again, because of this high pressure system, most of the moisture feed is going to be off to our east and not directed toward Nebraska, and we will see a warming trend across the state. And on Friday, we start to see that ridge pushing in the western half of the state, and we definitely will see normal temperatures, at least in the west, and near normal, I think, in the east as the warmer air starts to build in, as the last surge of cold air basically shifts off to our east, and we start to see the snowfall across the northern Great Lakes. The one thing I would mention before we go into the extended forecast is that from the Euro model standpoint, by keeping that piece of energy back toward the Texas Panhandle and waiting for the next system to come through, that tends to merge, and it'll bring the snow activity up in through Iowa and in Minnesota, touching portions of south central up through northeastern Nebraska, and we could see some accumulating snowfall. So this is a very iffy forecast, very unusual this far in advance that we see two models in extreme polar opposites of each other. So keep attention to the weather. Things could change rather dramatically over this next 3 or 4 days. More importantly, we are picking up that colder than normal trend in the 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday as that cold air slides to the east. In terms of precipitation, we do see a drier trend. So overall, Troy, it looks like if we can get through this next few days, then things look to dry out and be much more improved as we get to the end of next week.
Thanks, Al. Next up, the 2018 Farm Bill made it possible for states like Nebraska to legalize hemp production. It's been touted as a potential multi-billion-dollar cash crop by local lawmakers who wanted to see how the controversial crop would benefit the agricultural landscape here. However, in Nebraska's inaugural year of growing hemp, only 10 licenses were granted to potential producers. This week, Bill Dodd is taking a look at how the hemp industry is shaping up in the Cornhusker State. Bill?
Thanks, Troy. As of now, only 10 applicants out of several dozen in the state have been granted permission from the Nebraska Department of Agriculture to pursue hemp production. In the short amount of time these producers have had to acclimate to growing a new crop, it's becoming clearer by the day that an overabundance of hemp in the heartland isn't going to happen overnight. Out near Plattsmouth, Nebraska, there's a farming operation known as the Hop Yard. It's run by Annette and Bruce Wiles, and it's pretty obvious when you see it for the first time, this isn't your typical Nebraska farming operation. Bruce is a third-generation farmer who has had his fair share of tending to more traditional crops like corn and soy before they decided to try their hand at growing specialty crops like hops. And when the state made it official that hemp could be legally grown in Nebraska, they were one of the first in line to apply for a license.
So with Bruce being a third-generation farmer, and working with the university before, it's like, what do you do to keep kids interested in agriculture? What else can you do? Today, if you aren't on a large farm and your family doesn't have the equipment and the acres and you're in corn and beans, for a young kid to graduate out of college, you almost aren't going to be able to start your own business or farm. So our goal was to try other specialty crops that you can grow on a small acreage, that somebody can start on their own and really become a farmer at a young age without having to depend on family or go into debt. Hops was one of those crops, and then now with hemp, it's another specialty crop that's coming of age.
The work they're doing at the hop yard has greatly benefited from their professional relationship with the University of Nebraska's Dr. Ishmael Dwicat, who has been studying hemp for more than a decade. Ishmael tells me growing hemp requires much more finesse than many producers initially think.
One of the major mistakes, it's people need to know how far and the spacing, the plant density, how much fertilizer, how deep the seed is going to be planted. These are very important to know how many plants per acre, how deep the seed need to be planted, how much nutrient the plants need, how much water the plants need at different stages. Because hemp is a little bit different than soybean and corn. It's require more nutrients when it's growing vegetatively, and then we have to change the nutrient regime when they start flowering, especially if you are growing it for CBD. So these are some of the important information the farmers need to know. And besides, because hemp is a new crop in here, we don't really have enough pesticide, especially herbicide or insecticide, to be used in hemp yet. So we need to make sure that before we grow all out with the hundreds and hundreds of acres, make sure that we have enough hands to control the weeds, and then make sure that we plant it in a way that we won't have any insect or diseases on the crop.
Legislative Bill 657 was introduced by Senator Justin Wayne of Omaha and has paved the way for potential producers to apply for hemp licenses. While Senator Wayne was pleased with the passage of the bill and the initial push to get the new crop rolling in the Cornhusker State, he was even more eager to get more producers involved.
We created funding for at least 500. We don't know to date why the department only chose 10, but next year we're eliminating that authority, that if you meet the federal requirements, you will be granted a permit to grow. I mean, it's a $22 billion industry, they hope, in the next 5 to 10 years. So we think Nebraska can play a critical role, considering we have the best soil for hemp production, and being that we're centrally located, we can supply both the East and the West Coast fairly cheaply. So I think we'll have a huge impact going forward.
While it's been slow going in the first year of hemp production in the state, Annette tells me that testing the waters with fewer producers will ultimately be a blessing in disguise for those who decide to follow suit in the years to come.
So I think right now it's really state dependent on what's happening in these different areas. Until the USDA releases the policy, then everybody will be scrambling to try to figure out, are they within policy, are they below policy, are they higher than policy, and then work all that out. Well, you have all these farmers knocking on the door saying, I want a license, and our USDAs still don't even know how to manage some of that stuff. I think, Nebraska cautious isn't always a bad thing, especially with new crops coming out. The situation that farmers are in today with watching their pennies, I would say be happy that our state is the way that it is and that we are cautious as opposed to just letting the floodgates go, have our farmers have a bad experience, and then not really be able to do anything with this crop at some days. So.
For now, one of the biggest issues Nebraska hemp producers will face is the amount of wild or feral hemp that's scattered around the state. If CBD is what you're after, a greenhouse operation may be your only option, as cross-pollination could occur very easily with the current conditions for growing outdoors. And this could potentially ruin an entire crop. If, however, you're interested in producing hemp for textile fiber, An outdoor operation would probably work just fine. Either way, we'll be keeping an eye on how things are going at the hop yard when we get an inside look at their first harvest later this winter and see what changes, if any, lawmakers will put forth in the upcoming legislative assembly. And Troy, that's what I've got my eye on this week. For now, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks for that, Bill. For our final story today, Extension's Randy Sainer tells us livestock producers looking to diversify their herds might want to introduce sheep or goats to their operations. Now, it's no surprise that the management and nutrition needs are going to be different than with cattle, but Randy says it's worth weighing the benefits too.
So first of all, you're selling more meat off the same amount of forage, same land base, so you're increasing the efficiency of that land base. The key is about 1 ewe or 1 goat per cow is about what we recommend, and you don't really have to change your stocking rate on your cow herd. All you're doing is adding sheep. The thing is, the sheep will tend to eat more of the forbs, so the weeds, the leafier plants, the clovers. Goats are going to tend to eat more of the woody stuff, so if you have a lot of brush and things like that, they're probably better for theirs. Sheep are probably better for forb type plants. And if you have just a really good grass pasture with no forbs and stuff in it, which most people don't have, then you're probably better off with more cows, less sheep and goats, because the sheep are going to tend to clean up those forbs. But the nice thing is a lot of people spend a lot of money on herbicide to clean their pastures up when all they could do is buy sheep and sell the sheep as meat. The other thing you can get from sheep is wool, and merino wool and some of the Rambouillet has been selling pretty high lately. Some of our producers have been able to pay all their feed bills, which is the wool sales, so the meat is just pure profit for them. And when you look at a cattle operation, it's pretty tight right now to make money. This might be a way to add income to your cattle operation.
And here's another reminder on an upcoming event if you'd like to learn more about sheep and goats. The Nebraska Sheep and Goat Producers Annual Conference is coming up Saturday, November 2nd at the Nebraska College of Technical Agriculture Livestock Teaching Center in Curtis. Should be a really informative meeting. The contact number and the website to register is right there on the screen. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, we'll discuss distillers' grains as a complement to forage, and Lee Schultz will be our market analyst. All that and a whole lot more. We'll see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.